As I've mentioned the last couple weeks, this is sort of a tradition that we've got going at Spooky Ventures where on Mondays for the last few weeks before Halloween, rather than do the usual audiobook videos that we do original stories. Last year, one of the stories was read by Elizabeth Lynn Blackson. It was one of her stories. Most of the time, all the rest of them are mine, and I read them. This year, the 3 are all mine. The third story I'm going to do, I chose this one last simply because it actually has a Halloween angle to the story. And the story is actually called The Halloween Intervention, or Halloween Cthulhu and Blood Drinkers, oh my. And it includes a character from the last story, The Passage I read. Hunter Fleischer is in this one as well. He actually shows up in various names throughout quite a few of my vampire short stories. And I'm going to say that there's a Lovecraftian chant included in this story that I am not going to try to pronounce. I took it directly from Lovecraft's stories and used it. It's the standard Lovecraftian chant of, Cthulhu chant for the cultists, and I'm just going to say Cthulhu chanting or cultist chanting, something like that, because I am not going to attempt to pronounce those words. But with that out of the way, let's get the story going. Oh, actually, before I do get the story going, I should mention that it has appeared in several books. Most recently, it's in A Gallery of Oddities, More Collected Writings of Gary Hill. So if you look for this, you can find it there. Sorry, I should have gotten that out of the way. But let's go ahead and start the story now. The Halloween Intervention, or Halloween Cthulhu and Blood Drinkers, oh my. Hunter Fleischer took in the night. The sounds, the scents, the life of the after-day was always so invigorating to him. Then again, he was a creature of that world. The sun was setting earlier with each passing day, and he loved that. The humans were starting to gear up to their celebration of the macabre known as Halloween, and there was something almost welcoming to him in that time. He had recently caught wind of a threat to the reality that he, and in a different way the humans, enjoyed. At first he thought that it was just a silly superstition. As the calendar had inched closer and closer toward October, though, he was getting the idea that there might be more to it than that. He'd been devoting more and more time to trying to get to the bottom of it. Those of his kind, the humans called them vampires, but his kind seldom used that term, had an informal sort of societal structure. It allowed him to reach out to others and request their help. Many were on their way to join him in Rockford, Illinois. At first, he'd been worried that he wouldn't be taken seriously. It turned out that there were others who had heard of a cult such as Fleischer had become aware, a Cthulhu cult. It seemed that there were humans who worshipped an elder being who lies slumbering at the bottom of the ocean. Those cultists were pursuing a means to bring this ancient thing back to life. From what Fleischer had learned, if there was truth to this, it would represent a threat to the human race. That in itself would be a threat to his kind. The human race were essentially cattle to his people. They did their best to be mindful of the needs and well-being of the herd. They used what farmers would call conservation techniques to maintain the livestock, because if they were to go extinct, it would not bode well. Sure, they could survive on animals, but it was not the same. Even more troubling, though, this entity, if real, would just as easily destroy Fleischer's kind as it would the humans. After his initial skepticism, the fact that others took it seriously enough to make the trip to northern Illinois to help stop this told him that there might be some real threat to it. If nothing was done, it was possible that the fall of 1978 would be the last, not only for the human race, but also his people. Fleischer intended to do as much research into this cult as he could before the others arrived, but in the meantime he would have to feed. For now, though, he was just enjoying the night. Standing in an alley between a house and an Italian restaurant, he glanced across the street to a gas station parking lot. 2 humans were standing outside talking. Their attention was drawn overhead. A bat was circling. Fleischer decided that he had time for a little prank. Standing in the shadows where the humans could not see him, he compelled the bat to fly over to him. So many humans believed that his kind could turn into bats. While that wasn't true, his people had the ability to bend the will of creatures, some more so than others. Bats were particularly susceptible. At his bidding, the bat flew into the alley, landing just beyond him in the shadows. He watched the humans. They never took their eyes from it. Now it gets fun, he thought. He walked from the shadows and stopped just in the illumination of the streetlight. He stared directly at them. They returned the favor. He held their stares for a short time, looking as intense as he could. Then he turned and walked back into the shadows. He compelled the bat to fly back out of the shadows and circle over the heads of the humans. The prank had definitely worked. They both stared at the bat until, released from his control, it flew away in pursuit of its own meal. The whole thing made Fleischer grin. Sure, there were rules about keeping the identity of his kind a secret, but spreading disinformation was also something that they found useful. So many rumors, sunlight causing death, no reflections in mirrors, had been planted to muddy the trail to help them avoid detection. This way he was able to do that and have a little fun with it. Little did he know one of those humans would eventually become one of his kind and a bandmate. They would eventually talk about it, but for now, it was a little harmless entertainment. In Fleischer's world, there were various types of gathering. His kind were often solitary, but there were exceptions. Sometimes they have small get-togethers, just like humans. Random meetings were the most informal of those. When there were suspected transgressions committed by members of their species, tribunals were arranged to mete out various sorts of official punishments. Those were the most formal gatherings in their society. A gathering of 8 in Fleischer's home was not quite a tribunal, but it was more formal than most other meetings they might have. Fleischer spoke first after all had gotten comfortable. I think we all know why we are here, but I'll just restate what started this whole thing. One of my acquaintances told me about a religious cult that has been getting followers in the area. He said they call themselves the Cult of Cthulhu, and they were planning to hold a ceremony on October 31st to bring their Lord back into our world so that it may reclaim it as its own. I initially thought it was some stupid human mythology until I asked around. That brings us to Ivan. With that declaration, Ivan spoke up. When Hunter contacted me, I was reminded of something that happened 60 years or so ago. It took place in a town called Arkham. There was a similar cult, and they had the same goal. They gathered together and were in the process of manifesting some kind of change when a group of humans stopped them. That was not before some kind of portal began to open. One of the group, who went by the name of Spider, spoke up. How do you know about this? It was before I went through my conversion. I was dating one of the humans who was part of the group who stopped them. He told me that in the midst of their chants of, and this is where we have Cthulhu chanting, that I will not attempt to read, the wind started picking up. Strange lights appeared in the sky, and something he described as a circle of light and power appeared. He was sure he could see something attempting to come through the circle. How do you know he wasn't just imagining things? The question came from a woman named Julia. I knew him well. He was a private investigator. That part got a knowing nod from one of the others in attendance. Adrian Black, who had known the man she was talking about because of what at one time they had both been private detectives in Arkham. Of course, Adrian had been a child of the night even then. Yvonne continued, I had seen him facing death before. As humans go, he was about as fearless as I've known. In fact, had he still been living after my conversion, I would have wanted him to be one of us. He would have been well suited for it. If there was ever a human I'd trust on those types of descriptions, it would have been him. So how did they stop them? It was Spider again. They killed them. Once they stopped the ritual, everything went back to normal. Well, the phenomenon stopped. My boyfriend John was never the same. He could never describe what he thought he had seen on the other side of that portal, but it destroyed him. Psychologically, Fleischer posed that question. That too, but no, it destroyed him. He started drinking heavily. From there he discovered morphine. He was a broken man and was killed when he tried to steal drugs from the wrong people. I never saw anyone change so profoundly or so quickly. Yvonne paused for effect. Now here's where it gets even more interesting and ominous. As part of the investigation he'd been doing, John had started researching this cult. It wasn't just some one-time thing. This was a belief and sect that had shown up in various places and various times throughout history. I can remember hearing something about it when I was a centurion in the Roman legion, Spider added. Exactly. After John died, I started doing research on it, and I have continued that over the years. As far as I can tell, the whole cult of Cthulhu predates the human race. At least they believe it does. And as far as I can tell, it's true. Yvonne was fond of her pauses, and she took another there. There is some variation on the practices and beliefs of the various cults that sprout up like weeds here and there, but the core belief is that Cthulhu sleeps under the sea waiting for the stars to be right. His follower claims that he speaks to them through dreams, and they are hell-bent on performing rituals to bring him back. What happens if he comes back? Black was the one asking the question. Apparently they believe he will bring others like him, and all civilization on Earth will be destroyed, Yvonne answered bluntly. Doesn't sound like it would be much of an incentive for the followers, Black said. They welcome the destruction. I'm not sure if it's self-hate, the desire to watch everything burn, to make others suffer as they feel they have suffered, some sort of mind control, or some combination. Yvonne finished her lecture. There was silence for a short time. Spider spoke. Well, we have to assume this is an existential threat and handle it. If we're wrong, we kill a few humans. No great loss in the scheme of things. Besides, we can feed on them. So we need a plan. Hunter, what do you know about this current group's plans? I have only heard second and third-hand stories. Apparently what they are planning is set to happen on Halloween. I have no idea who the members of this cult are, or where they plan to do it, or even why they chose that date. I've been doing what I can to get more details, but so far it's been slow going, Fleischer answered. Investigation is my specialty. You don't do it as long as I have without getting good at it. Let me work on that, and I'll coordinate with the rest of you to make sure we are as efficient as we can be in gathering the necessary information, Black said. I have one thing I want to add, though. This is a fairly small area for all of us to be in for as long as we might be here. I suggest that everyone does their best to keep your feeding unnoticed. I know we all hate feeding on animals, but that might be a good idea. Otherwise, consider blood supplies at hospitals and blood banks and widening out from this general area. We can still meet here to coordinate our work, but attracting attention to ourselves is not a good idea. Fleischer's advice seemed to resonate with the others as it was met with quite a few nods. The group said their goodbyes and went their separate ways with plans to meet up every 2 nights going forward. As time dragged toward Halloween, the group were able to track down the location and time of the scheduled ritual. It was to take place in an often overlooked section of a forest preserve just outside Rockford itself. The ritual was to take place at precisely 10:17 p.m. The group had even surveilled a few members of the cult. There had been quite a bit of discussion about what should be done. Some members wanted to kill the cultists outright ahead of time, preempting the ritual. Ultimately, it was decided that the best move would be to allow the ritual to start. If this were going to be a threat they'd need to guard against going forward, it was better to know what they were up against. Besides, if a group of humans could stop at mid-ritual, they certainly could. They all took stealth positions around the location ahead of the event. They watched the cultists gather. Some came alone, others arrived in small groups. By the time they were all present, there were more than 30 of them in attendance. The cultists carefully chose their positions and formed a circle around one person who was apparently the appointed cleric or leader. They then began a chanting session, and again, this is the chant I'm not going to try to pronounce. Their chants became more insistent and louder. As had been described by Yvonne's boyfriend, the wind began to pick up, and energy started to grow in the sky and actually all around. The heightened awareness of the gathered observers allowed them to detect things that the earlier group could not. They noted that all wildlife had started to flee very quickly. There were alien smells emerging. The air reeked of some unknown and unwholesome forgotten aromas. With the winds getting louder, other sounds emerged in the mix too. They were not wind. They were also not of the contemporary earth. To the human ear, it was all about the torrent of wind, but to those with heightened senses, there was a far more unsettling cacophony of unknown chaos and disorder. A feeling of doom was carried along with the sound. The chanters continued to raise their voices ever louder. Eventually they were unable to get their voices above the volume of the ensuing torrent of sound and wind. The very force of that wind was making it harder for them to stand. Trees were bending. Some smaller, brittler branches broke and flew around in a seeming twister of air. Had there still been leaves on any of the trees, they would have been stripped clean by the wind. The energy in the air had formed something like a sphere. It was like another reality imposing itself on the current one. While the light and chaos swirling around that sphere made it difficult to see within it, there was definitely something within that pocket of reality. Movement could be seen. Now that the knowledge had been secured that there really was something to this ritual and this cult, the Night Children leapt into action. They needed to shut it down while they still could. As it appeared something, or perhaps several things, were attempting to come through the sphere, some of the vampires worried that they might have waited too long. Spider, realizing that killing the cleric would probably have the best chance of shutting the situation down, took to the air. The cultists were so enthralled in their ritual that they never reacted to the movement from the attackers. Spider came down directly on top of the cleric in a full death-from-above movement. He took the man's head off in one swipe. Blood shot outward as the body slowly slumped to the ground. The chanting continued and the sphere's power grew with it. Tendrils started coming out of it. They looked like living light and energy. They grabbed things around them and sucked them into the phenomenon. Yet it was obvious from the motion and sound emanating from within that something very large was making a trip into the opposite direction, approaching the existence where the ritual was still underway. The others had also closed range and were upon the cultists. They weren't looking to feed yet. They weren't going for nuance. It was all about making the kills as quickly as possible to shut down the insanity that was playing out around them. One of the tendrils from the sphere grabbed one of the cultists. He was pulled into the disturbance. At first he kept chanting, but then his chants became screams that became ever more distant before they could no longer be heard. The remaining cultists were dropping one by one as they were felled by the children of the night. As they dropped, their chanting went silent. There was a moment of still air and silence. All eyes turned toward the sphere to see if they'd been successful. Suddenly, the cacophony returned, breaking the short-lived quiet. The winds, which had been emanating from the sphere before, started pulling things into the phenomena. The size of the disturbance began shrinking. It was obviously closing in upon itself, and the vacuum created was pulling matter into it. The bodies of several of the cultists were among the matter pulled in. Julia found herself too close. A large tendril grabbed her and pulled her. Despite her superior strength and fight, she was pulled into the sphere. As it closed, it was obvious that she was lost. While the others were shocked, their kind had a special relationship with death. They did not grieve. Besides, they had much work to do to avoid detection. They went about that work, feeding on the freshly killed, moving corpses, and disposing of them where they would not be found. Whatever had become of Julia, they knew that they had succeeded in protecting their world. Spooky Ventures is the home for spooky content and spooky merchandise on the web. Check it out today at spookyventures.com. And remember, always keep it spooky.